If you're daily engaged in creative activity, you may be surprised to learn that you're in a tiny minority of people who do this. That's not because you're wired differently, it's because you remember how to do it. So back in the 1960s, Charles Lim, a researcher, was asked by NASA to design an experiment to tell which of its new employees was going to be very creative. It was a very good predictive test, and he decided to use it on school children. So he gathered together a group of 1,800 school children, aged 5, 12, and 15, the same children. So it was a longitudinal test. And he started off when they were 5, and the results are really interesting. So at 5, 98% of them were considered very creative. And at 12 years old, that number had shrunk to 30%. 30. What on earth had happened? And then at 15 years old, the same children tested only to be 12% creative. Then he used the test for 1 million adults above age 31, and the number shrank to 2. So you're in 2% of the population, 2% of the population. Lim decided that what was happening was that children had been taught in school to do both analytic thinking and creative thinking. And in the ideas of the time, he said, the neurons were fighting each other in the brain. We would no longer say that now. We'd say that there are 2 pathways to thinking, and the 2 pathways are different. You can't walk down 2 pathways at the same time. And I hear you saying, but wait a minute, there's only one legitimate way to think, because that's what we're educated into. We're indoctrinated. But in fact, there are 2 ways. And the second way is not talked about much in the education system, but it's a way of thinking that is passed from generation to generation of artists. I was taught it. I was lucky. My dad was a visual artist. So, back in the 19th century, Hermann Helmholtz was one of the most important physicists of the time. He was one of the most famous men in Europe for his discoveries and his inventions. And towards the end of his life, in fact, on his 70th birthday, he devised the stages of creative thinking as he'd experienced them. And I'm going to draw them for you. So, number 1 is what he called preparation. And if you're a musician, you've been preparing for your creativity all your life. And I'm drawing a musical notes. This is preparation. Preparation by listening to music, playing music, thinking about music. And most researchers say that in order to be creative, you have to have 10 years of practicing a skill. So the preparation is really important. The second stage he saw in himself was incubation. And I'm going to draw a hollow log here with an animal inside, little animal. And it's incubating, it's hibernating, waiting for better weather. The third stage is the classic light bulb moment stage. So I'm going to draw a light bulb. So that's the eureka moment. And the fourth stage that he saw in himself was validation. And I'm going to draw an equal sign because he's a mathematician, physicist. So these are the 4 stages that scientists saw. And scientists, naturally enough, are interested in the way that scientists think. And they're pretty cut and dry. And you mustn't think that your thinking has to come in this order. It can be any order at all. But the point is that creation comes in stages. It doesn't have to come all at once fully formed. So, after a while, artists' voices were heard. They said, look, it's sort of like the way we create, but it's not. It's a bit and a bit not. And Glabanov, a researcher in 2013, said, in fact, what happens for a scientist is very different than what happens for an artist. A scientist starts off with a problem. They bring to it a number of questions. They reframe the questions. They get a wonderful eureka moment and the problem is solved. But for an artist, it starts off as a feeling, a vision of something or an idea that's incomplete. And the idea needs reflection. And after a while, the idea gets so powerful that it actually speaks back. It talks back. And an artist loves this, the way the work has a life of its own and talks back. And any idea, any rules that the artist has, the work itself comes and kicks them to pieces. Another researcher, Giselem, in the middle of the century, said that the work for an artist starts off as a nudge. And after a while, the artist feels chaos and disorder. And she feels that she's adrift in a sea of possibilities and indecisions. And she feels the surging of the unexpressed. And so the work grows bit by bit in all sorts of directions at once, but the point of the work isn't known until the work is complete. A major researcher of our times, Arne Dietrich, called by many neuroscientists to be the most important important mind on the planet, said that there are two sorts of thinking, like we said before, but he calls them extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic thinking happens largely in the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is just above your eyebrows, and it's considered by many scientists to be the peak of human evolution. It's unique to human evolution. Only we have it, and some apes have it. So that's the sort of thinking that is logical, reasonable, rational, that's predictive. And predictive is really important because we desperately needed it, as you can imagine, all through evolution. What was coming over the hill, we had to be able to predict. In fact, he says the whole brain is a predictive system. The prefrontal cortex also houses our values and our attitudes. And that's where we feel who we are by our prefrontal cortex. So, isn't it logical that the finest flowering of civilization, the art, the music, the poetry, that comes from the peak of evolution, the prefrontal cortex? And Dietrich's shock answer is no. He says that the artist, to do intrinsic thinking, needs to decorticate herself. And perhaps that's what, this is my speculation only, that's what the artists were doing in Colin Martindale's unique experiment in 1975, where he found out that artists universally went into a stillness before they started their creation, and only artists, not non-creative people. So what he's saying is that an artist needs to decorticate himself or herself so the thinking can go all around the brain. And again, my speculation, I see it as a dog let off a leash and it races off all around the brain and it brings back something strange, something smelly, something that is nothing like you'd expect, because that's what a creation is. It is something that breaks our predictions, it breaks our expectations. So what we have to do as artists to start this is to decorticate ourselves. And that sounds like a terribly difficult task until you remember that we all used to do it when we were 5 years old. And what we've got to do is get back to that sort of thinking.